Hello, and thank you for joining today's session. I would like to start things off by thanking the group at Zoo for hosting the Horizon series. Now more than ever, it's really important to bring creators and technologists together to be able to learn, exchange ideas, and to be inspired. And also, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. I'm Rob Hoffman, Worldwide Media and Entertainment Industry Manager for at Lenovo, and I'm going to be your host today, where we're going to hear some insights from an exceptional individual that is an artist. He's a technologist and an advocate for artists and the creative industry as a whole. In today's session, we're going to spend time exploring how artists and technologists are always at the forefront of his work, whether it be in research and development of tools used within the AEC, manufacturing, and media and entertainment industries, or having in-depth discussions with leaders in their respective areas of art and technology, and enabling them to share their insight and their knowledge with the broader community. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Chris Nichols, Director of Chaos Labs and host of the CG Garage podcast. So thank you very much for joining us today, Chris, all the way from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and that of Chaos Labs to kind of tee things up?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Thank you for that kind those kind words. Yeah, sure. I was thinking about like how to sort of present myself, because I kind of have a strange mix of personalities that I've gone through. So I don't know. I think we have are we going to do a slide presentation? Yes, here we go. So I did this little small presentation here, which is very, very rudimentary, but, and I normally don't put pictures of myself up that much, but this seems to fit well in terms of how I'm about to describe things. And I do want to note that what you're looking at is actually not a photograph of me. It is a computer rendering of me done by an exceptional artist named Ian Spriggs. And I have a he's a great friend of mine. And he's what led to him making a portrait of me is sort of the journey that we are going to go through. So let's go through the first slide here, the next slide. What really happened is when I was in school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to eventually go into architecture. And the way that I decided to do that was to actually double major in art and math. And because I really loved, math, and I loved the analytics of math, and I really loved creating things in art. And I found out very quickly that they are actually very related in a lot of ways, but really the two groups rarely get together in different ways. But I did find some relationship in that in architecture, and that's sort of what led me to become to follow getting a master's in architecture. And what I really became impressed about, and this was in the 90s, was basically computer graphics. Computer graphics became my complete passion in architecture, and that's what led me to sort of get into doing computer graphics, was through architecture. And that, because of that, you can go to the next slide, please. Because of that, I decided that I was going to, the next slide, please. I decided I was going to take all my knowledge of architecture and bring it into visual effects, because visual effects is actually very similar problems. You take very complicated things that need to be done and find a solution for them, and you try to create incredible images out of it. And visual effects became sort of something I became very passionate about, and led a big portion of my career where I worked on a lot of big movies with Digital Domain and Sony and Method and a lot of other places, and I really became sort of passionate about visual effects, especially in the world of what's called lighting, which is the things that create the renderings that you see on the screen. At some point, I stopped being interested in actually working on movies and more interested in understanding how to solve problems and how to do things. And this eventually led me to my next journey, which is to work for Chaos. And Chaos is basically a company that creates software that is used in the visual effects industry. In fact, they've won an Academy Award for their software V-Ray, which is what they're most known for. It's a rendering engine. And I've known the people at Chaos for years and years and years, and they invited me to come on board and be part of what's called Chaos Labs, which is what we started. And Chaos Labs was really, it was the bridge between the developers and the users of the software. I became the person that says, here's what the users are looking for, and here's what the developers are developing, and how can we create this journey together? And it was really, it's been, a lot of fun. I've been there for almost 7 years or almost 8 years. I'm losing track of the time. And that's been a lot of fun. And they've given me a lot of freedom to come up with the ideas and things that I want to do, including the idea that one day I said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. What if we start a podcast? And I said, sure. And we'll get into the CG Garage podcast, but that became something that became extremely important over the years. And it's been a lot of fun. So here I am. And, through Chaos Labs, I ended up meeting someone called Ian Spriggs, and he and I chatted for a long time, and I've really been trying to help him, give him new software, new ideas. Here's some new ideas. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And he keeps churning out these beautiful portraits. And at one point he said, I think I'm going to do a portrait of you, Chris. And so that's basically what you see on the screen. And it sort of illustrates where I am at this point. But it's been quite a journey for sure.
Nice. Very nice. And I mean, being able to get, a representation of yourself done by Ian Spriggs. I mean, he is probably one of the premier digital portrait artists, in the world today. I mean, he is
absolutely.
His work is shown up anywhere and everywhere, and in many cases, people don't believe it when you tell them that it's actually a synthetic image and it's not actually a person.
Yep.
But this is, we're kind of, you and I are kind of in a really fortunate place. I mean, we're in a really cool industry. We can work with really inspiring people, very, very, engaging, very colorful people in certain instances. And, but everybody's got to have a start. You got to start from somewhere. You started off in the AEC visualization side of things, but, when did you know you wanted to go down that path? I mean, has it been something as long back as you can remember when you were, when you were yay high? Or, I mean, when did you know you wanted to go down this path?
Oh, I thought I wanted to be an architect since I was like 7. And I thought it's mainly because I met this guy who was a friend of my parents, and he had just this booming personality. And I said, whatever he's doing, I want to do that. And he was an architect, and I got really inspired by it. And I thought, I loved art, and I was really good at math. And I said, this could actually work, And so that's basically what ended up happening. And I did go into I went full on, I got a master's in architecture. Yeah. I ended up working at Gensler, and it's a very large architecture firm, the largest architecture firm in the world. Yeah. And so I worked there, and I was, but I was really good at doing CG at the time. And so even though I was a good designer, they sort of wanted me to focus on that, because that was a skill set that was pretty rare, in the 90s. So they said, "Well, can you just focus on that?" And I said, "But I'm a designer too." And they said, "Well, we'll put you on a design team." And then I quickly realized I actually didn't care about buildings anymore. I actually only cared about the images. So it became less important for me to actually build the buildings. And that's, it sounds sacrilegious as an architect to say that you didn't really care about the buildings, but that was the case. And so a friend of mine said, hey, we need to build all of New York City for a movie called Day After Tomorrow. If you have time, maybe you could work on that with us instead. And so that's basically what led me to jumping over to visual effects.
Well, and that is, God, you're like the perfect person to talk to, because you can segue. You're like a great setup person, but there's been a lot of talk, and just what's happening in the various industries that are using technology, whether it's media and entertainment, whether it's AEC, manufacturing, design, where it's, you've been on both sides of the fence. And, there's always this talk of convergence, whether it's the artists, like yourself, which have made the jump from one discipline to another, or not necessarily one discipline, but one outlet or way of distributing content to another, or or the talent, as talent moves back and forth, or the tools or the techniques. Are you seeing this convergence? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
In terms of jumping from industry to industry kind
Well, I
of
mean,
thing?
just making comparisons between the AEC and manufacturing industry and the media and entertainment industry. I mean, are there similarities in the tools that they're creating or the talent that they're
Absolutely.
employing?
Yeah. And listen, I'm not the first architect to work in visual effects. There's a lot of us, not as much anymore, but especially, of my, shall we say, generation, there's a lot of architects that made that jump. The reason being is that back then, there weren't any schools for visual effects as there are now, or they weren't
Right.
as big. And so you would hire anyone who knew how to do computer graphics or some kind of things like that. And that ended up becoming architects, were actually somehow had that knowledge base. And so that was the case. These days, you're not going to necessarily see that many architects doing the jump forward because people are going to school specifically for visual effects. So they're
Right.
coming into the industry knowing everything about what that is. So it is, and the fact is that's great. If people want to learn about that, that's really cool. But the fact is that the fundamentally the tools are the same. Like a vertex is a vertex and a rendering is a rendering, right? Like you're still like those are still, people still use the same things. You may not necessarily do giant explosions in architecture, hopefully not, but you still
Hopefully
do,
not.
but you still do other things. And so that's kind of there's a lot of similarities between the two worlds for sure.
Very nice. Well, okay, so you've had a very interesting path already. So you started off in architecture, then you started and then you moved into the film industry, working
Mhm.
at the the who's who of studios that everybody aspires to work for that would be in the industry, working on projects that are amazing to say the least. But when did you take a step back and say, okay, I've been on the art creation side of things. I'm going to go and dip my toes into the tools development pool, for lack of a better way of putting it. What made you kind of take a pause and make that switch?
It's an interesting. I mean, there was a lot of things that were going on in the industry, and this is, it was a kind of a tough time in the industry when I sort of made that jump. There was some turmoil. A lot of the jobs were leaving Los Angeles at the time, going to different locations, mostly driven by tax subsidies and things of that nature.
Yeah.
And I just didn't want to leave. My wife works here; she's a very successful artist as well in visual effects, and I didn't feel that needed to leave. But I also didn't necessarily, like, I was kind of at the point where, like, okay, I've done movies. Okay, I keep doing these movies and they keep coming out, and that's great. But I didn't necessarily get the excitement of the new as much as I used to. And when I talked to Vlado was the V in V-Ray, and he's been a good friend of mine for a long time. And I said, and we were talking about what's going on at Chaos and stuff. And it turns out that basically there was a lot of innovative things that they were thinking about doing, but they didn't quite know how to approach things. And I said, well, that's an opportunity for us to think about it as a lab. Like where do we go? What do we want to do with these things? And so that's what sort of led me to say is he hired me and he says, okay, well, let's start thinking about doing creative things within what we do as part of breaking, breaking the edge of what the technology can do. So, we focused on a couple of things that became interesting. One was virtual production. I became very interested in virtual production. And for those of you who don't may not know what virtual production is basically It's the idea of shooting a film virtually through, but live in certain ways. So you basically control a camera, but what you're looking through the camera is a virtual world. So you're looking into a virtual world. Think of it more like a little bit like VR, and then you're capturing people that are in motion capture suits, and you're basically seeing your whole movie take place in front of you. But I became very interested in the idea of how can we get the quality of what's happening live on the screen as good as possible? And it was cool for virtual production, but it's also something that can transcend into all kinds of industries. Everyone wants to know, how can I make it look better, faster, right? And so that became a huge thing. And, like architecture is interested in that. Everyone's interested in that. And I'm sort of really glad I sort of got involved in that. And I became very interested in ray tracing and live ray tracing and making things look really good instantaneously. And that sort of, is kind of an important thing that I was interested in. The other one was about digital humans. I became fascinated with digital humans back when I was at DD. I'd worked on several digital human projects over there or films over there. And the idea of what became fascinating to me is everyone, was the uncanny valley was a big discussion at the time.
Yeah. I was waiting for you to say that.
And I'm not going to get into the details. Hopefully people understand a little bit about what the uncanny valley is. But what fascinated me is that everyone was really, really, really like terrified of the uncanny valley and wanted to get out of it. And like, that was the big goal. I became not just interested in that, but I also became, why does the uncanny valley exist in the first place? Like, what's causing these things and what's that? And so I can't really, if you're working on a film, you have to get out of the uncanny valley. But if you're an R&D, it's like, well, let's do a little more analysis here. Let's figure this out a little bit. And so I became really fascinated with digital humans, and I sort of started a project called the Wiki Human Project that became, something I became very interested in doing. And that's how I met a bunch of people in the industry, or I got involved, a lot of people in the industry all over, people like Paul Debevec and Ian Spriggs, as I mentioned earlier. And I really just sort of like wanted to, get involved in that digital human aspect. So those are the two areas that I sort of focused on. But like I said, those ideas can transcend to all kinds of industries. And I thought that was something that I still was able to do in that area.
Man, you've done it all. You've done it all, and you've done a lot more than what we've talked about. So, but as director at Chaos Labs, you're all about the interaction with that of the artist and the community. And what are really the challenges that you are up against each and every day as you're trying to develop tools for the broader community? What are the things that you kind of are just like, oh my God, this, that you kind of, not necessarily bang your head against the desk with, but what are like the big challenges that you have to overcome when creating artist-driven tools?
It is a very big challenge. I think honestly speaking, it's very interesting when you're an artist or you're working in visual effects or in architecture or whatever. You have a problem that's right in front of you, and you're trying to solve that problem. The issue with that is that you don't really see beyond that problem. You just say, this is a thing. Can you fix this? Right. And so they'll go to the developers and say, fix this or make this a thing. And then you'll do that. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, that kind of, you did fix it, but it didn't necessarily do everything I wanted. So now I need to do the next thing and next thing. And the way that I equate it is it's hard sometimes for users to see the forest for the trees, right? And sometimes a little bit that way. And so I always say, it's like, I always use the example of Henry Ford when he says, like, if I gave people what they wanted, they would say, make me a faster horse, right? Like they never even thought of the car as a possible solution, right? Yes. And so that's the thing that I try to do is I try to absorb all this information from all these people, all these problems that they seem to be having, and say, what if we did this instead? It's like, well, we didn't even know that's possible. It's like, what if it was possible? Right. And then they're like, well, that would be amazing. And I was like, well, that's what we should go for. Instead of solving this one little thing that you have here that made, help you for 5 minutes, why don't we think about what you need next year and make that the goal? And then we have a different journey together. And that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's almost like you're a developer and a therapist trying to help them work through their problems to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a very specific example. I mean, this was many, many years ago. I mean, I was working with a great architecture firm, and they were talking about what they're trying to do and how they're trying to use some real-time technology, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, okay, that's great. And I think we should think about real time. And I said, but what if you could ray trace in real time? And he said, that's impossible. I was like, what if it wasn't impossible? And they're like, they was like, because they wanted to solve, like, just get me this. And I was like, but what if we just went all the way? It's like, then you wouldn't need all these other little stopgap things, because really what you want to do is you want to ray trace in real time. So instead of all these little stopgap things that we would develop that would distract us, just go for real time, like real time ray tracing. So that's really, those are the kinds of conversations I have with people, and they're interesting, and they get people excited as well as myself. So that's good.
Well, there's probably a few folks that have joined today's session that are in the software development side of things, but then also a lot of people that probably aren't. What are some of the things that people just, don't understand what goes into creating software, or not necessarily creating something from scratch, but just maybe, doing incremental updates to existing solutions as well? What are some of those things that people, may not be aware of that are core to you being able to bring something to market?
Well, software is very, it's a very tough thing, right? Especially when you're doing something like ray tracing, which is extremely hardware intensive, right? So as such, you constantly are optimizing your stuff for hardware to make sure that you get the best performance that you need out of it, right? So that often means that when hardware makes big shifts, you have to throw away everything and start over again in some cases, and that's okay. And making that seamless for the user experience is also difficult because you have to be able to do that. And there's often times where, yes, you can increment, you can add features, this, that, and then you get this legacy bloat that happens and you have to worry about that legacy bloat. And then sometimes what happens, you basically say, okay, for, this next version of the software, we're going to have to rebuild the whole thing with this completely new way of doing things that's going to be better. And the user may barely notice a difference at first, but it's going to allow us to get to the next step, right? And so those are the things that you're like, okay, so roll up our sleeves, rebuild the engine. You get in the car, it's like, it drives the same. It's like, yeah, but it's a completely different engine. And those are the challenges. And honestly, it's also exciting. Like there's the world of hardware right now, especially on the CPU and GPU side of things, is moving so fast that suddenly we are doing things that were not possible. When I did my first
Moore's law.
When I did my first virtual production thing, way back in the day, it's like 7 years ago, we were able to get about quarter HD. We were able to get a pretty good image. It still had some noise, but not too bad. But we used 32 GPUs to make that happen, right? And I'm able to get a full HD image with better noise now on a laptop, on a laptop GPU. So the speed of GPUs is like ridiculously fast these days, and it's great. But you have to catch up and make sure everything works.
I love how you say way back in the day. 7 years ago.
It's crazy, but
things have progressed.
And that's really something else that I've gotten to really enjoy that I didn't get to do when I was in visual effects is I get to work with people with cutting edge stuff, or like people like you, Rob, you're very kind, and you get me some really cool stuff that I can play with. And then I get some, my friends over at NVIDIA give me some stuff as well. And I'm like, okay, let's try the latest toy and see how fast we can make this thing happen. So those are kind of fun and exciting things as well. I mean, these are things that I wouldn't be, privy to doing if I'm sitting there, rendering pixies for Maleficent.
So. Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting that the way you kind of phrase that, where it's almost like we're coming back into, put on our way back hats, where it's like way back in the good old days when let's say the media and entertainment industry and the tools that were being developed, every single release was just almost like a completely different way of doing things. And it was a drastic change and a drastic shift in production. And then, as time progresses on and, tools mature, it doesn't feel like you're innovating or progressing or bringing new ideas or technologies to market quite as quickly. While you might be doing a lot of work underneath the hood, the end user might not necessarily see it. But now we're kind of moving back into this interesting technological era where things are starting to accelerate again, where we're seeing greater capabilities with hardware platforms, as you had eloquently mentioned, on the CPU and the GPU side of things. With those big shifts or dramatic changes or increases in capability and performance, I mean, that really has to open up a lot of doors and opportunities as to where you can go with your technology as well.
It has. So what's going on now, which is interesting, is that visual effects and even architecture rendering and all that stuff was very iterative. It had to be by design because the process of getting to what you need to do took time. So you had to make a change and wait, make a change and wait, make a change and wait. Those iterations creates a pipeline that's much more what shall we call a waterfall pipeline, right?
Right.
And that means you just sort of pass the buck down the line. And visual effects was all about just like a factory passing everything down the line, right? And which is different. Today, the real time is becoming much more important. And real time is, I'll define real time as anything that is, it doesn't have to be, 30 frames a second or 12 frames a second or whatever. It's anything that allows you to iterate quickly, to iterate and not wait, where your mouse is still working while you're working. You don't wait.
To be able to,
there's no
be able to work at the artist pace.
Right. And that can include all kinds of things. And then what that means is interesting. What not only has that made that iterative process better, because when you have an iterative process where you're constantly making, then you can tune it to where you want to go in a much better way. So it's not just about being faster, it's about being better. You can really you can finesse something until it feels right, not just like, I guess it's right, good to go, because version 27 is as far as we can go. And so that's a good thing. The other thing that's really becoming a big deal now, and I'm very excited about, is collaboration. Because now that people are actually able to do things, and what's interesting is the gaming world is starting to come into this a lot. The idea of working together in the same way that you do in video games is happening in actual work. Where people are actually working together all in the same virtual environment. And that's becoming a really interesting development that I think is going to be a big deal in the future, where virtual workplaces, combined workplaces, are going to be much more important in that way.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so this is, what? Let's switch gears, because I don't want to, I want to spend some time on hearing some of your stories. I mean, we speaking of like the community as a whole, and how you're involved in it and how they're involved in what you're doing. You have an incredibly successful podcast called CG Garage with an insanely large weekly viewership. What inspired you to kind of just say, hey, I'm going to do a podcast?
Well, that is a funny story, because I really didn't think about that much. Like I said, I have a really great job where I have a very long leash. Vlado lets me do a lot of things. And I basically say, if I have an idea, let's do it. So what happened is, I live in Los Angeles, as you mentioned, and the traffic here, well, before the pandemic, traffic was horrible. And basically I spent a lot of time in my car, and the best thing to do in the car is actually just to listen to podcasts. It's a great way to catch up on stuff. And there's so many great podcasts out there, and I really kind of enjoyed them. And there's some interview ones that I liked that were pretty fun. And I said to myself, well, and they talked about how they got onto podcasting and what they did.
Right.
And so I said to Lon is, someone I work with in the LA office. And I said, hey, Lon, what if we did a podcast? And he said, well, what is it going to take? And I said, we need a couple microphones. And then I know a lot of people. So we'll just start interviewing people and just have a chat, and we'll make it very casual. And here was the other thing I was going to do. It's like, I'm not going to edit them because I don't have that kind of time. So we'll just, whatever we record, that is what it is.
It's going to be raw.
It's going to be raw. And it's like, it says, okay, when, it's maybe like $1,000 investment in microphone like this one here. This is one of the original microphones that we started with. And it's like, okay, we'll do that. And I didn't really know if it was going to be any good. I just said, let's try it. It's an experiment. And I knew there was a couple rules I wanted to do. One is I wanted to do them in person, which I can't do them now anymore, but that was the rule at the beginning. I wanted them to be, have good sound, because that's an important part. That's what I learned. Like, you can't fix bad sound. So I got some decent, good microphones, and I had to be consistent. Has to come out once a week, like it, without, there's maybe there's probably 2 weeks a year that it doesn't come out, but it always comes out every Monday. Right. And that's a big deal. And it kind of took off. I didn't expect it to, honestly. So, and here I am, like 6-7 years later, I've got 300 plus episodes. So almost 7 years.
Well, this has got to be a little bit strange, you being on the other side of the microphone, because you're usually the one asking the questions and whatnot. And it's, and this is strange for me because I'm usually on the other side of the microphone as well. So under normal circumstances, you'd be giving me the line of questioning, but this is one of those instances where it's kind of cool to try on a different pair of shoes, but it's also a little bit intimidating as well, because I know that next time we see each other, hopefully when social distancing measures are lifted soon, we'll be able to have a drink, and then you can critique me on my performance. Okay.
You're doing great.
Well, thank you. So, okay. Well, speaking of podcasts, who's the first person you interviewed?
Steve Prieg.
There's been so many.
I think you prepped me with this question. I had to look it up, but it's Steve Prieg, who is a great guy, animation director. I think he's at MPC now. I'm not sure where he is, but I knew him back at DD, and I first worked with Steve on iRobot, and he was really cool. But Steve was also creative, animation director on a bunch of digital human. He won an Oscar for Benjamin Buttons.
Nice.
So he's, that was Steve and I have had conversations about the Uncanny Valley forever, right? Like, honestly speaking, I think Benjamin Buttons is probably the first film that ever was able to get out of the Uncanny Valley in my mind. But Steve is a very fascinating person. And it was actually even at that first episode where you get to learn, because you're interviewing someone, you get to learn things that you never really knew about them. Like, for example, I found out that Steve Prieg did legal animations, those for court cases.
Oh my God. Forensic animations?
Forensic animations. And you know what he did one for? He did one for the O.J. Simpson trial.
Oh my Lord.
Yeah. I was like, what? So it was crazy. And him telling these, so it's great. But yeah, Steve has been really fascinated.
At that time in the world, everybody had seen one of his animations. Everybody. Oh my God. Well, I mean,
anyway, so that was my first interview was with Steve. That I remember for sure. It was fun.
Well, you kind of started off. I mean, that's a pretty strong start. Academy Award winner, Benjamin Button tie-in. I mean, and you've gone obviously a lot further than that. I mean, I've kept track and watch a lot of your podcasts, I mean, you on a regular basis have the who's who of artists or technologists or visionaries, whether it's Gary Yost, father of 3ds Max, or Shuzo Shioda, who's CEO and president of Polygon Pictures, or having Academy Award winning directors, whether it's Tim Miller or Peter Ramsey or Brenda Chapman. But then you also even take it into different areas where you're bringing in technologists, the likes of like Mark Bettee or Vicky Dobbs-Beck. I mean, you really have a very eclectic group that you bring in and interview. So of all these eclectic and very diverse individuals that you interview, who would probably be your most interesting person that you've interviewed, and why?
There's been a lot of interesting.
You can have more than one answer. I mean, that's
I do have. I'm going to try. So you're absolutely right. One of the cool things is finding people who you wouldn't necessarily think would have part of the conversations about computer graphics, and see if they can contribute to that conversation somehow. And I was at THU, which you and I go to whenever possible.
And one of the next Horizon sessions that we're going to be doing is going to be with Andre Luis from THU as well.
So. Oh, there you go. Yeah, Andre and I are good friends, as you know. But I was at THU, and I always bring my podcast gear when I go to conferences, so I can do podcasts whenever I'm there. And I was thinking about people I wanted to do podcasts with. And one of the big key speakers that particular year was a guy named Norman Seif, who is a fascinating person, but really doesn't know anything about computer graphics at all, right? His what he's best known for is his photography. He has photographed some of the most famous people in the world, and including
some of the most iconic portraits as well.
Yeah. So he is like the godfather of rock and roll photography, if you really want to think about it that way. He's done some amazing, and like, let's just put it this way. He did the photograph of Steve Jobs that everyone knows, right? Like that's the key, like that's the person that does that. And so, but he was a fascinating person in the way that he described how he gets people to act or react or bring out their personality. And so I didn't know what I was going to talk to him about. And then suddenly it clicked. I said, he's going to help me figure out this uncanny valley problem, because he doesn't have any of the technology baggage that we all do, where we're like, it's all about the skin and the pores and the teeth. And what I was like, tell me about the personality. What's missing in the personality with the uncanny valley? And that was an incredible conversation, a really good one. So that was so that's an example of something that I would.
I was at the THU, and for those that don't have the acronym playbook at home, it's the Trojan Horse Was a Unicorn Conference, which is a very interesting name for a conference, but amazing conference. Highly recommend you attend. But I actually sat in on his session where I was kind of like, why is this person talking to the community? And and you said it very well, where it's like he doesn't have any of the baggage that we all have, where he's looking at problems or he's looking at art through a different lens than we would look at it, just because of where he kind of sits in the greater community. And listening to him talk about image composition, or more importantly, trying to draw out the emotion, how to create an environment with his subjects that in some cases was extremely uncomfortable for them, to be able to elicit a look or a response and to capture that iconic photo, whether it's Steve Jobs or John Belushi. I remember that one. Holy mackerel. Yeah. Steve Martin. It's just the work he's done is well, I mean, that's why he
spends 4 hours with his subjects, then slowly gets them to break down into to really get to their soul, right? Now that's what he calls it, and it's very interesting to see that process. But
I think we've just because I know that we're kind of getting close up to the end of our time, because we want to make sure that we have ample opportunity for those that are tuning in to ask any questions. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat window, and we will do everything we can in our to answer any and all questions that come. So what we've got about a minute. Well, a minute. We won't be that. There you go. We'll do one last question. So actually, I'm going to lie. We're going to do two questions. Sorry,
Okay.
and so I'm sorry about that. It's sad because the stories that Chris has are incredible, and we could spend a week talking constantly and never cover off everything. So it's great to have the time to talk, but it's also it pains me that we've got such a short amount of time that we can spend together on this. But kind of to start wrapping things up and to move into the Q&A portion, where do you see kind of some of the biggest challenges that artists and studios are facing, or the industry as a whole today?
I think there's going to be like I mentioned, I mean, I think real time is going to be a big thing, right? And that in order to do that, the studios are going to have to give up a lot of legacy thinking. And that's going to be something that's going to have to take place. And interestingly, the visual effects industry, which was always like, cutting edge, everything was new, et cetera, is now starting to feel some of the baggage of legacy, and changing things are going to be a little bit harder, but it's starting to definitely happen. And one of the things that's actually been interesting of the situation with the pandemic has actually accelerated and that process, I feel, because people started to work from home a lot more. So they had to come up with innovative solutions where they had to give up some of the legacy systems, and that sort of primed the pump to think different, right? And like for things like virtual production, as an example, started to really become a lot more important in those areas where let's see what we can do from home. Let's see what I can do together, or how do I collaborate with my coworkers while working from home. So all of those things started to happen, and that became very interesting. And the same is true for architecture. I think architecture is starting to see that as well. I actually am also looking, in terms of the world of architecture, what's also becoming fascinating to me is there's opportunities in architecture. There's opportunities for architecture in the virtual world, meaning non-built worlds. And so architects and designers may have a role to play in what's being called the metaverse. So that's also becoming a very interesting thing that I'm following very closely.
Oh, perfect. Well, all right. So now my last question. So where can the audience go to learn more about Chaos Labs, or go to download any CG Garage podcasts?
Well, Chaos Labs is basically, it's kind of loosely scattered all over the chaos.com site. So you can go there. There's blog posts that I put up where I talk about trends in the industry. So you guys can check those out. And there's also, a few things that basically just go to Chaos.com and look at the blog posts that are there. Most of what I do in actual lab stuff is a little bit because it's with customers, and there's a lot. Right. Let me just put it, I sign a lot of NDAs. Let's just put it that way. But they're exciting.
I signed one of those of yours as well already, so I'm very
Yeah, you did. In terms of CG Garage, you guys can definitely follow us on our site. Is chaos.com/CG Garage, and you can go there. And we also have a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. So those are the places to follow us. And definitely, if you like us, please subscribe to us and share us with your friends, because that's always what makes it popular.
And the link, I believe, is in the chat as well. So with that said, let's go ahead with the first question. And all right, talking about virtual workspace. Okay, you were talking about virtual workstations. Do you have any insights on how they are expected to enhance the production pipeline for artists and creators?
Yeah. I think what's going to happen is that instead of sitting there and waiting down the line, you're seeing it live at the same time. So it is I mean, it's like building a house. Imagine if you built a house and only one person was allowed to work at the house on the house at a time. That's the way it's been for a long time. But now everyone's working on it at the same time. So someone's holding something up and painting this while the other person is doing the next thing. So the process is not going to be so much of a waterfall process anymore. It's going to be much more of, what's known as, actually it comes down to software again. It's going to be an agile process, right? That's the process. You have these little scrums, right? And you burn them out. And he's like, okay, we're going to build out the kitchen now. Everyone's working. You guys are painting the walls and doing, oh no, the wall's not working with these cabinets. Okay. So you refinish that wall and I do this cabinet, in a different way or whatever it is. All of that's going to be collaborative, and then therefore versioning and decision-making is going to be different. It's just going to happen as you go. So that's really how I feel. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and well, then here's one of the interesting things is that you've got technology providers like NVIDIA that are also working toward trying to solve this solution as well by coming to market with collaborative tools. The same could be said for our friends at like Autodesk and what they're doing as well. So yeah,
Sure.
it's one of those things where I didn't quite think of it like that, where it's more the production line way of thinking, where it's like, so of everybody kind of doing their piece, then handing it off to the next person, everybody can collaborate together. So we've got another question here. What tips would you give someone wanting to get into the 3D and CG worlds? Where should they start?
Well, the thing that's interesting about the CG world, there's so many things you can do with it, right? You can, if you want to be part of the architecture, do you want to do a character design? Do you want to do what do you want to do with CG? Is an interesting thing to do. So before you sort of just jump into the tool, just explore the world of that. In interesting way. There's some great sites like ArtStation. That's a really good one, for example. And there's, if you're interested in the architecture stuff, there's a really another great one called CG Architect. You can check that out as well. And there's some really good sites to sort of see and inspire you to get things, right? And then if you really get into things, look at what tools those people are using and try to use those tools as well. There's also a bunch of free tools out there which are really great that you can try as well. Things. There's free versions of SketchUp. If you want to just start with some very fundamental things, you can do that. There's a Blender is a free tool as well, and obviously you can do that. And then also education versions of Max and Maya. Exactly. I was going to say there's actually, I think there's I think Maya even has what's called a personal learning edition. So it's like, it's a full-fledged Maya that is just meant for non-commercial use. Non-commercial use. So those are great. And in fact, V-Ray even offers a PLE license for V-Ray for Maya. So if you guys are interested in that, that's also available. So that's really lots of tools that you can do to check that out.
Yeah, well, then also combine that with, there are, because you kind of mentioned in your part a little bit earlier in your introduction, where there just weren't a lot of schools that were training in, in 3D content creation. So you went down the architecture path. There are an abundance of schools, not only specialty schools, but also curriculum within universities, but also within K through 12, schools as well. So, I mean, the next generation of artists are already kind of learning their craft, and they haven't even left high school yet.
And there's a ton of YouTube out there too.
Yeah. I mean, there's no end of resources out there, and also be active in the community as well. There are more discussion forums and also veterans from the industry that are very interested in instilling their knowledge on the next generation of storytellers. So. Yeah. So, okay. Hey, all right. So our last question. So any thoughts on NFTs and how they are currently impacting 3D artists in your community?
Oh, yes.
I want to hear this one.
Okay. So I've actually gone down this rabbit hole, which it is exactly what it is. And actually, there is a series of episodes on my podcast, which I'm doing specifically about NFTs. And so I did one with Sally Slade, and sort of expressing her journey. It's like, I just need to know what it takes to make an NFT. So she just talks us through the process of what she had to learn to actually just put out an NFT on the internet, right? Like what it would take. And that was really fascinating. But then I actually did an episode, and it came out a couple of weeks ago. You should really check it out, with a guy named David Yermak, and he's the head of the finance department at NYU Business School, Stern Business School. And he is an expert in crypto, and he explained his thoughts on NFTs and what they're going to do. I think there is going to be a massive amount of, it's a really good thing generally for the community to be able to have value for their work. Often digital art specifically was just seen as something on the internet and never really had value. Now, suddenly with the advent of NFTs, they have a value in it. There are some downsides that are hopefully temporary right now to NFTs. One is it's creating a frenzy slightly, and that frenzy is affecting the community in some ways. Some people are not necessarily super happy about NFTs, and they're getting very angry. So that's kind of something that is happening. And I'm trying to do through my podcast, I'm trying to give people as much information so there's not as much misinformation out there about what's going on in the NFT world. And then the other one, obviously, that's come up a lot is obviously the carbon footprint of NFTs. Yeah. And how they are effective. And so there's a lot of thoughts in terms of what that is as well. And so we get into that in the podcast and discuss that as well in terms of what is the actual carbon footprint of an NFT in reality, and also what is being done to highly reduce the amount of energy that's needed for NFTs in future versions. But I do believe NFTs are going to be a huge part of the community for the foreseeable future. And they are going to affect not just images and art, but I believe, I talked about the metaverse. That's how you're going to buy and sell stuff on the metaverse, is in NFTs. I mean, that's the only way it's going to really work. So I'm very excited about it. I think it's an interesting thing that's going on, and I'm still very much sort of watching what's going on. Yeah. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of NFTs or not a fan of NFTs. I'm watching it. But I feel like things like the podcast are a way for us to bring that conversation to the forefront and inform people and let them make their own decisions about what they want to do.
Fantastic. Perfect. So, hey, thank you very much, Chris, for your time today, your insight, and sharing your journey through the, I wouldn't say the industry, because you've kind of spanned a couple of them. And I highly encourage those of you that are watching today's session to go and take a look at the incredible speakers that or guests that Chris has had the pleasure of interviewing in the past. It's a wealth of information, and highly encourage going and doing that. So, Chris, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Zoo team, for
yes, thank you as well.
This session as well. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your calendars to join us today. And have a great remainder of your day. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future on another webinar.